Thank you so much for joining me for this wonderful history summit that Lindsay has organized. I'm so delighted to be here with you. I'm Dr. Lauren Turek, and I am an assistant professor of history at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. I'm a historian of modern U.S. foreign policy and politics, and my first book, To Bring the Good News to All Nations, Evangelical Influence on Human Rights and U.S. Foreign Relations, has just come out with Cornell University Press. I'm really excited to share a little bit of information about the book with you all today. What I'd like to do first is provide an overview of the book itself, the core arguments that I make, and the general structure of the book. Then I'll focus in on one vignette to provide a glimpse into how I explore and develop those core arguments and the narrative of the book. To Bring the Good News to All Nations tells the story of how and why politically conservative evangelical groups in the United States became an influential lobbying force on issues related to U.S. foreign relations, especially human rights and religious freedom, starting in the 1970s. American evangelicals approached the waning decades of the millennium with grave concern for the unredeemed souls of the world. With their belief in the Bible as the inspired Word of God, evangelicals took very seriously the scriptural mandate to go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation in order to make disciples of all nations. For this reason, in 1974, the famous American evangelist Billy Graham called on evangelicals throughout the world to join together and renew their commitment to global evangelism. At an international conference that brought together evangelicals from Western nations as well as the global South, Graham reflected on the events and transformations of the two preceding decades. He told his audience that he saw a world increasingly open to evangelism, yet also beset by structural crises, natural and man-made disasters, and spiritual malaise. From the cultural revolutions that shook Western societies in the 1960s, to the oil shocks of 1973 and the Watergate scandal, Graham warned that the world may be standing at the very brink of Armageddon. He believed that humanity was teetering on a precipice, and only Christian salvation could prevent it from toppling into the abyss. For Graham and like-minded evangelicals who viewed social ills through the lens of apocalyptic biblical prophecies, the changes and challenges of their times made the evangelistic mission of the church seem especially urgent. And evangelicals heeded his call. Pentecostals, Southern Baptists, and other American Christian groups flocked to Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe, eager to evangelize and plant churches. In the process, they forged close relationships with their brethren abroad. They also witnessed firsthand the perpetration of religious persecution, state violence, and acts of genocide against inhabitants in their new mission fields. While overseas, these missionaries wrote letters home to their congregations, describing their interactions with the people they met. When they returned to the United States, they shared details about their evangelistic experiences with their churches, their prayer groups, their friends, and their families. These experiences and interactions, in tandem with a deep-seated anti-communism, shaped the opinions that American evangelicals held about foreign affairs and international human rights. In short, overseas missionary work, new technologies and communication networks, and a sense of belonging to a transnational community of believers exposed evangelicals to foreign policy issues abroad, gave them a means to share information across borders, and kept them focused on the needs and challenges that their brethren faced in other countries. As conservative evangelicals gained more political power during the 1970s, they were better able to use that influence to shape foreign policy. The concern that many evangelicals felt about religious repression in totalitarian regimes and the threat it might pose to their global missionary agenda informed evangelical foreign policy opinion. Evangelicals, focused on what they saw as their duty to spread the gospel, privileged religious freedom and the freedom to evangelize as their most fundamental human rights. Concerns about religious persecution and other abuses against the faithful led these groups to advocate for a Christian foreign policy, one that upheld core religious values and protected American missionaries and those they evangelized. Yet, these views also led many evangelicals to perceive authoritarian and other expressly anti-totalitarian regimes as friendly to their objectives. This perception enabled evangelicals to interpret repression and state violence in authoritarian countries as an acceptable or even desirable effort to combat the spread of communism. Now, in my book, I set these perspectives within the context of the diverse movements for social justice that emerged in the 1970s. And I argue that human rights as a concept, as well as a set of norms, remained contested and open to interpretation in this period. This fluidity, coupled with the power of Christian advocacy to shape the contours of congressional debate and public opinion on human rights issues, allowed evangelical foreign policy interest groups to adopt human rights language to promote a conservative Christian foreign policy agenda. In essence, their activism helped to define a conservative human rights vision that proved influential in shaping U.S. human rights policies during the Reagan years and beyond. And I tease out these key themes in a series of chronologically overlapping chapters that explore the events, ideas, and technologies that helped connect the global community of evangelicals and explain how this sense of community contributed to the emergence of an evangelical foreign policy lobby in the United States by the end of the 1970s. I then show that lobby at work in the late 1970s through the 1990s in regions of particular significance to U.S. foreign policy in the late Cold War, the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, Central America, Southern Africa. In each region, I identify the major evangelical leaders and organizations involved in each country, discuss the policy issues that they tackled, and uncover their interactions with fellow believers, foreign officials, and U.S. policymakers as they worked to make all nations of the world into what they hoped would be safe havens for their evangelism. The case of Guatemala is one that I found particularly interesting. In March 1976, a devastating earthquake struck this small Central American country. In the days that followed, American evangelical Christian organizations, large and small, fanned out into the cities and countryside to deliver aid to their brethren, to help the country rebuild from the disaster, and to plant churches. One of these evangelicals, a man named Reverend Carlos Ramirez, led a group of missionaries from his church in California to Guatemala City to assist in relief and reconstruction efforts and to spread the gospel. Shortly after arriving, he and his missionaries began to hold Bible study meetings in the homes of middle and upper class residents of Guatemala City. A brigadier general in the Guatemalan army named Rios Montt joined one of these Bible study groups in 1979 at the urging of a fellow army officer. He converted to evangelical Christianity and became a member of the new church, El Verbo, or the Church of the Word. In March 1982, Rios Montt had gained his ground in the organization. He was working as the academic director of El Verbo's Christian Day School when he heard an announcement over the radio. A group of young officers in the Guatemalan army, disillusioned by government corruption and apparent election fraud, had staged a coup d'etat at the National Palace in Guatemala City. They were forming a military junta, and they had named Rios Montt to be one of its members. Rios Montt asked the elders in his church in El Verbo for guidance before accepting the army's call. And Reverend Carlos Ramirez told reporters that after the call, he and other church elders had gathered, quote, to lay hands on Ephraim, to pray over him as the Bible teaches, and to send him out from us with God's blessings to the palace. Through prayer with the leaders of El Verbo, Rios Montt came to believe that God had ordained him to lead the junta. And within a few months, he had marginalized the other junta members and declared himself president of Guatemala on June 5, 1982. Now, interestingly, his relationship with American evangelicals helped to shape his political rhetoric, as well as his dealings with U.S. officials and the tenor of his short-lived regime. The missionaries from California and the local El Verbo elders counseled Rios Montt during his time in office, and they coordinated with evangelical parachurch organizations in the United States to amass financial as well as political support for his policies. Although El Verbo and its US-based parent church were denominationally independent, they operated within this diffuse but large and energetic network of evangelical Christian groups active in the US. Because of these connections and the strategic significance of Guatemala, many influential evangelists such as Pat Robertson took great interest in Rios Montt, motivated as much by their shared Christian beliefs as by Rios Montt's strong anti-communist credentials. American evangelical leaders and parachurch groups began supporting Rios Montt's regime through public outreach, fundraising, and congressional lobbying. Despite mounting evidence that Rios Montt's campaign against Guatemala's communist insurgency involved the mass killing of indigenous Mayans, these conservative evangelical groups argued that the dictator's Christian faith would compel him to improve the country's human rights situation. Rios Montt appointed several members of his church to serve as advisors, and he received counsel from the church's U.S. missionaries as well. Church members met with Reagan administration officials, U.S. embassy staff, and CIA officers in Guatemala, as well as in the United States, on matters related to foreign aid, human rights, and military funding to the regime. Despite evidence of human rights abuses, U.S. foreign policymakers and the Reagan administration cautiously embraced Rios Montt. They thought he might be a key anti-communist ally in Central America, where the Reagan administration was engaged in covert wars against left-leaning governance. When members of Congress balked at providing military assistance to a leader who was committing human rights abuses, though, evangelical Christians in the United States rallied to the aid of the Guatemalan leader. Televangelists called on viewers to raise money for Guatemala and to send letters to Congress and the White House calling for support for Rios Montt in his fight against what he termed a communist insurgency. Many of these evangelicals believed that by supporting Rios Montt, they would be helping to defeat communism in Central America and thus to make the region safe havens for evangelism and the spread of their faith. The Reagan administration worked to provide aid to the general, but encountered congressional roadblocks. When this happened, U.S. evangelicals stepped in to help Guatemala acquire military materiel, and they worked alongside the Guatemalan army to establish strategic hamlets in the countryside as part of Rios Montt's efforts to pacify rural areas and root out suspected communist insurgents. Now, newspaper reports detailed the dismal conditions in the villages, yet evangelicals asserted that they were providing both Christian charity and a bulwark against communism. Ultimately, U.S. evangelical oversight of the model villages outlasted Rios Montt's tenure in office. Many of the involved organizations continued their ministrations with funds from the U.S. AID even after Oscar Mejia Victorias removed Rios Montt in a coup in 1983. So the intricate overlapping web of influence that evangelicals from the United States wove or found themselves woven into in Guatemala in the early 1980s exemplified the transnational connectivity, shared outlook, and wide-ranging presence of the global evangelical community. Rios Montt's perception of himself as a national redeemer and the support that he garnered from evangelical Christians in the United States illuminates a great deal about the religious and ideological beliefs that grounded evangelical understandings of human rights and anti-communism in this era. American evangelicals trusted Rios Montt when he argued that pacifying the countryside and removing the communist threat would bring justice, peace, and human dignity to poor villagers. These messages resonated with pre-existing evangelical beliefs about communism as an existential threat not only to a nation, but to religious faith as well. Evangelicals believed religious freedom, the freedom to evangelize, was the core human right because they saw salvation as the basis for human freedom and the truest cure for man's suffering. When Rios Montt adopted the distinctive language and leadership style of their particular form of apocalyptic American Christianity, U.S. evangelicals thought they had found in this Central American leader the personification of their most deeply cherished objectives. Support for this brother in Christ flowed freely in response. So what are the key takeaways from this case? Well, U.S. Pentecostal missionaries and their Guatemalan brethren played a key role in the Rios Montt regime. They shaped the dictator's discussions with the Reagan administration. They factored into his internal strategic planning, and they guided his understanding of his role as a Christian leader. In the U.S., evangelicals lobbied in Congress and pressed the administration to provide funding. And when that funding proved difficult to get, they moved to provide it themselves. So they helped gain aid for this regime. Their missionary work in Guatemala after the earthquake contributed to a dramatic religious and social change in that country, turning what was once a predominantly Catholic nation into one that is currently between 25 and 40% Protestant. Their involvement in the Rios Montt regime brought financial and political support for his policies, which had some disastrous effects. So they had a social impact in this country. And through all of this, they functioned as very powerful non-state actors. Now, their support derived from their desire to spread the gospel, and they argued that Christian leadership would stem abuses and help people find salvation, even though it actually contributed to further human rights abuses. Well, similarly, in my chapters on the Soviet bloc in South Africa, I explore how evangelicals use such justifications and their vision for human rights to support a range of other foreign policy objectives. By showing how American religious groups operated abroad, how they forged transnational cultural ties, and at times shaped official U.S. foreign policy, my book offers new insight into how non-state actors exert influence in the realm of international relations. Rather than looking at the religious right and its influence on domestic policies and hot-button social issues, my book looks at the religious right in a global context. Situating Christian foreign policy lobbying in the late 20th century within the framework of the larger human rights movement exposes how interest group activism helped to define the meaning and content of U.S. human rights policy, and how it moved that policy to the right. When American evangelicals collaborated with their brethren in Eastern Europe and the Global South to navigate the rapidly shifting social and economic conditions of the 20th century, they revealed that shared religious identity had tremendous power to forge connections as well as political influence across national borders. Thank you so much for taking the time to hear about my book today. I look forward to engaging with your questions on Twitter.